wisdom, scribes, and education with a sidebar to he's good at agriculture. Now, Jehoiakim's name means Yahweh raised up or raises up, which is interesting because his initial name was Eliakim, which is El raises up, God raises up. And Pharaoh Necho in 2 Kings 23, verse 34, changes that name to elevate it to the memorial name of God, not a reference to El, the mighty one, but to Yahweh, the God of heaven and earth. And it's interesting that a pagan king changed his name to be a more specifically God-centered name. There's an awful lot in a name, and we're going to find in this story the names mean a lot, and we'll look at them as we go. Now, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with part of the vessels of the house of God that he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels unto the treasure house of his God. So here we have Adonai, another name. He allows this to happen. God allowed this to happen, as we'll see that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men in chapter 4:17, which is our title for this theme this week. And he sets over it even the basest of men, one of which might be an example of Jehoiakim. Now, he only took part of the vessels because he was on a hurry to get back home to make his claim to the throne, as we mentioned in verse 1. But he eventually returned to take all of the treasure from the house of the Lord. And we'll quote, the treasures of the king's house, and cut in pieces all the vessels of gold that Solomon, the king of Israel, had made in the temple of Yahweh. And that's 2 Kings 24, verse 13. So the vessels themselves, although they are literal objects, they represent the servants of God. And that's where we want to compare us to this story. Each one of these vessels has the capacity to serve and to be filled with the God's glory. But whether or not they are serving and filling the God's glory, that's up to you and I as vessels to give our God a place to dwell within us, to fill us with his thinking, his righteousness, his glory, so that we can serve him and be a vessel filled and fit for his kingdom. Now, Shinar is an ancient name for Babylon, and Genesis 10 is a good place to go for that. Again, it would be a different class. We won't do that today, but that's where you can get the roots of the history of Babylon. And you're going to find the connections between Daniel and Genesis are huge. In fact, I'll say it now just to make the point. You will not understand Daniel if you do not understand Genesis. It's that important. And I'll go one step further. You cannot understand Revelation if you do not understand Daniel and Genesis. So it behooves us to get all the imagery that Daniel starts with, as we'll call it, Apocalypse Volume 1. And then John, it gives us Apocalypse Volume 2, that which Daniel seals at the end. Worthy is the Lamb that was slain to open the book and loose the seals thereof. So those two major prophetic words that are going to fill a lot of our time the next day and a half have their roots in Genesis, and it's useful to know. I'll point them out, but we won't spend much time there. You can play with them on your own. For this purpose, we're going to mention Shinar as the root of the very first worldly kingdom on the planet, Genesis chapter 10. And we recall the events that take place in Babel or Babylon. The word is the same in Hebrew. And that is the confounding of the language. For what reason? Because the vessels were trying to serve themselves instead of serving their God. So the concept that's being delivered to the people of Israel in their day, in Daniel's day, was the same that was delivered at the roots of the kingdom of Babylon in Genesis chapter 10. And those same words ring equally profound to us in our day. So from the house of the God to the house of his God. And that's what we see the king of Babylon doing. So who was Nebuchadnezzar's God? Well, Daniel 4:8 tells us that at the last Daniel came in before me, whose name was Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God. So he tells us who his God was. His God was Bel. And Bel was a reference to the chief god of Babylon. And we'll cite some name changes as we go. We'll see Bel takes a prominent place in some of the names, including the name that Daniel gets from Nebuchadnezzar as he is deported. Let's look at Jeremiah chapter 50, verse 2. So, talking about the God that was the God of Nebuchadnezzar, here we have, declare you among the nations and publish and set up a standard, publish and conceal not. Say, Babylon is taken, Bel is confounded, Merodach is broken in pieces, her idols are confounded, her images are broken in pieces. The wheel will come full circle. The God that was the God of Nebuchadnezzar will be taken, confounded, and the images will be broken. And we'll find just in a couple more hours that the God that used to be Bel ultimately will be replaced in Nebuchadnezzar's life by Yahweh. And Daniel is the reason that that happens. Now, a lot of times when we're looking at the Bible, we're going to be doing what I like to call looking for some nuggets. And it's a reference for panning gold. It's great when you're looking at words in a concordance and you see a word that's only used once or twice and it gets our attention and it gives us an echo back to somewhere else. And that's kind of what I'm referring to when I'm talking about panning for gold. You spend a lot of time in a concordance and you look up a lot of words and you find that a lot of them are translated exactly the way they are, and it's 854 times. There's not a lot to learn. But then every now and then you find something that opens up the whole story. And we're going to see that a few times. And when we do, we're going to point it out, because the name changes that take place in this story are one of those nuggets that we're going to see. Excuse me. Verse 3, the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, and he should bring certain of the children of Israel, of the king's seed and of the princes. So Ashpenaz, his name only appears one time. Here it is. And Gesenius tells us his name means a horse's nose. I don't know what that says about his parents or what it says about his nose. I've got a big one. Maybe it's tied. But nonetheless, that's the only time that word is used. Not much we can gain from there. But we do know his job. His job is he is the master of the eunuchs. Now, remember that last verse we read where it talked about the children of Hezekiah being made eunuchs in the hand of the king of Babylon? Well, a lot of people can get hung up on that, but I think it's put in the story specifically for us to learn, because this is exactly what was prophesied would happen to Hezekiah. Put yourself in the position of Daniel. Daniel has no home now, no family, and no prospect of having children if he has been made a eunuch. And by the way, that's not a gentle process. You and I here read eunuch, and we know what it means physically. And if we stop and think about that, imagine you as a teenager being brought to a foreign king and having your ability to have children removed physically forever. And by the way, this is days before anesthesia, so it's not a gentle process. For one moment, we cannot think they had it so much easier in their day than we do. So when we look at these examples, we've got to give it the credit that these brethren had to endure and still remain faithful. The word princes, the Hebrew is a word nobles. In fact, that's how it's translated here in the RSV. It's only used 3 times. This is one of them. And the other 2 are both in Esther, and it's translated nobles in both of those times. So we've got these nobles of the king's seed that were brought to that master of the house of the eunuchs. These children in whom there was no blemish. And now that blemish, the term in whom was no blemish is actually a double emphatic. Children with no blemish. It's emphasized that these were unblemished. They were well favored. They were skillful in all wisdom, cunning in knowledge and understanding science, such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. Now, these were teens, as we mentioned. The word young men, the word children is the same word in the Hebrew that means young men. It's the same word that is used to describe Joseph when he was 17, another indication that's approximately his age. Now, the first double emphatic that is really pronounced to us in Scripture is Genesis 2:7, where it says, "In the day thou eatest thereof, thou shalt die, which is effectively what the Hebrew says. It's a double emphatic emphasizing dying, thou shalt die. So that's the same way we need to look at this, emphasizing no blemish. They would be physically fit or complete. They were beautiful in both appearance and attitude. They were taught, yet teachable. They were cunning, but able to put knowledge to use. Science, which is the study or review and arranging of evidence. So they were able to do, not just learn. They could learn and do. Having the capacity to learn is only the beginning. Benjamin Franklin said it this way: there is very little difference between not reading and not being able to read. So if we know how to read, but we don't ever spend time doing it, we're not much more than illiterate. So being able to know and then do is critical. Now, the learning in the Hebrew is the word book. Gesenius has it as a writing. Therefore, the written and spoken tongue, which brings us right back to Genesis chapter 5, brings us back to Genesis chapter 10 and 11. So the roots are there. It's not this. Is that not the same qualities that God is looking for to run his kingdom? You can add that they would be neither married nor given in marriage, and that completes the analogy. What the kingdom of the world was looking for was the same as the kingdom of our God is looking for. The question is, which one do we want to be aligned to when we are brought before the kingdoms of this world? Now, the Chaldeans were an ethnic sect within Assyria and Babylon. They had influence in both empires, and they have been noted historically as highly advanced people. So what we're seeing really is an apprenticeship, if you will, and it was not exclusive to Israel. The focus is on Israel, but this is what they did. It wasn't just to Jews. This was a well-oiled machine. Go in, take captive of a city, bring them out to bring the best that they have out so we can make them ours and convert them to our way of thinking. It's not much different, although certainly more aggressive, than the university influences of our day, where it's a chance to learn the things of the world. Now, what we do with those things is certainly up to us, but the intention of the teaching institution is to convert our way of thinking to them. And that's the example that was put before Daniel. So the king appointed them a daily provision, and that daily is again emphasized. It's a daily provision. The word provision is the word in Hebrew for word or speech. So it's not just food we're talking about. They were given a daily speech of the king's meat. Now, the king's meat is actually a Persian word, and it means king's food or delicacies. So conversion at this point begins not just with the culture and the language and the speech, but also food. Conversion begins at the belly. And if you're a fat guy like I am, that makes an awful lot of sense. So the purpose was to take these 3 years, remove all their old nationality and all the old religious examples that they had from their nationhood, and mold them into a new nationality, a new religious force, and a new image. The prize offered for conformity was to stand before the king. The alternative was death. Now, among these were the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And unto him the prince of the eunuchs gave names, for he gave unto Daniel the name of Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. Now, what do these names mean? Daniel, the mighty one, is judge, or Al is judge. Hananiah, Yah has been gracious. Mishael, who is like Al? It's almost exactly like Michael. And Azariah, helped by Yah. So they all have names associating themselves with their God of their homeland. So what does their name get changed to? Daniel's name becomes Belteshazzar, which is Bel has protected the king, named after Nebuchadnezzar's personal god. How about Hananiah? He becomes Shadrach, command of the moon god. Mishael becomes Meshach, guest of a king. And Azariah becomes Abednego, the servant of Nebo, or of the shining fire. From the gods from the God of Israel to the gods of their new world. And I'm going to make a plug here for us today that I hope we all walk away with and endorse. When we refer to the three friends of Daniel, please let's keep in mind their real names, because they never converted to the ways of Babylon. And when we think of Daniel, we do not think of Belteshazzar. But oftentimes when we think of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, we think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Let's do our best to bring back their old names that they never left behind, because like Daniel, they continued to serve the God of their fathers even when their life was on the line. That's our next class. All right, verse 8. Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. He was not a vegetarian. Daniel chapter 10, verse 3 said, he ate no pleasant bread, neither came flesh nor wine in my mouth, neither did I anoint myself at all 3 whole weeks, until 3 whole weeks were fulfilled. It's not that he was afraid to do it. This was done for a purpose. It was not pride. It was respect for both the king and the ecclesia. He is balancing right now, which makes him a great example for us. The principle is the problem, not the food. We can give thanks for the food. Paul gives us the example of meat offered unto idols. We can give thanks for that food. The idol means nothing. What difference does it make? God provides. We're thankful for the provision. Totally acceptable way of looking at that. But others can be offended. That meat has been offered unto idols. And so we're exhorted to, if what we're doing might offend someone else, refrain. And that's the example Paul uses on this very topic. The purpose is not the food. The food doesn't make any difference. It's the principle. Could not Daniel and his three friends simply given thanks and done what the New Testament suggests is an appropriate solution? The answer is they absolutely could. We give thanks for our food, not knowing its source or the hands that made it in many cases. What we're seeing here is a man at approximately the age of 17 has been offered the world, and he wanted to make sure the image he was being formed into was his gods, not the gods of his new king. Now God brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. And the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink. For why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort? Then shall you make me endanger my head to the king. So this word tender love, the RSV translates as compassion. Going from into favor and tender love are two different Hebrew words, but both of them are normally translated mercy. So the emphasis of this is mercy. Gesenius labels them as zeal and the womb. So we have together the intercompassion. You might have heard of like a motherly instinct. So he's got an inner compassion to take care of them. Another good example is Joseph, if we look at how he was taken care of in some pretty diverse situations because God's hand was at work in his care. Now, this official in verse 10 may be a different official because it was specifically appointed for their health care and education. So we've got a specific job now. Keep them growing and healthy. Now, the word sort is a very interesting word. Here's one of those nuggets in scripture. The Hebrew word means rejoicing or circle. Only 4 people took this stand. The same 4 were blessed by God, we'll see in verse 17. Remember, they were among the Jewish nobles. So many are called, but few were chosen. The fear that this request would encompass the whole circle, sadly, was unrealized. 4 of them stood for the truth. But what does that mean? The rest of them did not. We might compare that to us in our day. What do we call the young people in the Christadelphian world? What is this camp called? It's a CYC camp, a Christadelphian youth circle. Think about that for a minute. These 4 brethren had assembled this circle amongst themselves. And not only did they have to stand up against the world before them and around them, but they had to stand up against the world amongst them. In their ecclesial setting, most of the CYC was converting to the world and leaving the things of their God behind. So what about this endangerment? It's the only Hebrew time this word is used in the Hebrew, and it means to be guilty. If those in your circle look worse than the rest, I will be guilty before the king. So he's got self-preservation being balanced by his compassion for this small circle of 4 brethren. Verse 11, then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. So the RSV and the Oxford margin has the steward for Melzar. So Daniel says to the steward, and he requests just a trial period. Give us 10 days. Let's see what happens. If in 10 days we look bad, we'll go do it your way. But let's give 10 days to see how we fare doing it our way. They're giving an example of letting God have an opportunity to demonstrate his work in their life. Notice they have still at this point retained their Hebrew names. They're not willing to give up. Their names still exist in Hebrew. Now, pulse is something grown like fruit, vegetations, vegetables, could even refer to grain. In fact, the Septuagint says seeds. Strong's gives us vegetables. So basically, let's eat fruits and vegetables and drink water and see how we do compared to the dainty delicacies of the meat of the king. And after that, let our countenance be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children that eat the portion of the king's meat. And as thou seest, deal with thy servants. So we consented them in this matter and proved them 10 days. Your call, give us 10 days, then we'll conform to whatever you think is right. They put the matter before Yahweh's hands, much like Daniel in the fleece, Gideon in the fleece. So both sides do agree to these new terms. And at the end of 10 days, their countenance appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. You know it's a miracle when a diet of vegetables and water makes you fat. All joking aside, they were healthier than the rest. Yahweh provided an example of their faith. He used them as vessels for his glory to show that the king might be able to do it his way, but the God of Israel can do it a different way. So Melzar took away the portion of their meat and the wine that they should drink and gave them pulse. For these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all vision and dreams. So knowledge, this is discerning between good and evil. Education is useful, but only when used to further God's glory whenever possible. So they're educated, but they're devoting their education to developing the character of God in their life. Another critical lesson, they had solid acquaintances. Being a Christadelphian is a good start, and it's a qualifying point, I grant you that, but it is not the only one. Living the word is also a requirement. The New Testament says it this way, not all Israel is of Israel. And here we have an example of an entire national CYC coming forward before a king, and 4 of them are willing to stand up for the truth. Many are called, few are chosen. But all 4 of these were blessed by this association. It matters the people we spend time with. It matters how we work with each other. It matters the people we choose to influence and let them influence us. The power of a CYC and a weekend like this to bring us closer together to our true purpose of serving the God of Israel and being filled with his glory is really the model of this first chapter. They had learned the things of the Chaldeans in addition to the things of God, not instead. They didn't go off to an international university by force and walk away from what they knew. It added to what they knew. They brought the truth with them. That's what separated them from the herd. All the requirements were met, plus the addition of vision and dreams. At the end of the days that the king had said they should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. This is 3 years, as we saw from verse 5. And note, Daniel had already appeared before Nebuchadnezzar at this time. The events of chapter 2 take place during the 3 years mentioned in chapter 1. So in the interest of time, we're going to summarize chapter 2 briefly because we all know the story. But let's look at it just to make sure we get this in our mind. Chapter 2 and the relationship that begins between Daniel and his friends and Nebuchadnezzar starts in Daniel chapter 1. So we know the image that he saw, this great image whose brightness was excellent. This is verse 31 of chapter 2. Stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. So we have the history of the kings of men filled even to that day with violence and corruption. You can go back to Genesis 10 and start this story of the violence of Babylon. And citing only Nebuchadnezzar's reign would have been enough. But if we look at the reigns of other Assyrian kings, study of the story of Nahum, the bloody kings of Assyria, and the things they did to people they conquered, disgusting. Violence was what they did. That was their art form. The Assyrian Empire, as violent as it was an empire conquered by Nebuchadnezzar, adding to the tale of his violence. Even today's newspapers support that from the whole region. The image head was of fine gold, breast and arms of silver, belly and thighs of brass, legs of iron, feet part iron and part clay. I know we've all heard this story. Many of you are probably as qualified to teach this, so I'll be quick. Notice the image is top heavy. The heaviest of these three metals is gold. Silver carries a lesser value. In verse 39, it regards the kingdom as inferior to Babylon. Brass drops it down another scale on the valage notch. In verse 33, we have iron even lower. And by the way, if you took those values even today and decided, let's go build a fence out of these four materials, the cost would still be relative. The golden fence would cost you much more in the same order. Any unstable foundation can be broken by a proper timing and vessel. And seeing the instability of this foundation is an example for us to see as we look forward to today when the stone that was cut without hands smites the image at its feet and breaks it into pieces. So without hands is without human design, without human craft. Not just as no man could know the dream, no man could fulfill it either. It had to be done without the hands of men. So we have an unhewn stone. It's shaped without the ways of the flesh. So we compare the image, luminous, shiny, formed metal, everything beautiful, expensive, versus a stone. Not a gem, not a pearl, but a rock formed by God through wind and water. Verse 35, then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, gold broken into pieces, became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. So in the last days, we see this image standing again, a development of a confederacy, including the same territories. Ezekiel 38 backdrop. Remember, contemporary to Daniel, same story. We don't have time to do it now. Also have another little nugget thrown in here. The threshing floor now is brought into play, which is a nice tie to a heap of sheaves and a valley for judgment. Greek word Armageddon. The kingdom begins to grow to a point where the earth is filled with the glory of Yahweh. That's the end of all the kingdom of men. It's brought to powder and replaced by an unhewn stone that becomes a mountain of the glory of God. This is the dream, and we will tell the interpretation thereof before the king. Thou, O king, art a king of kings, and the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. No interruption by Nebuchadnezzar, so they're telling him the dream. He doesn't stop. You can almost picture him with his mouth open, listening to them. He knows what the dream was. He didn't tell his nobles. In this just a couple year period of time, Daniel had earned enough respect to get this audience before the king and be uninterrupted as he delivers both the dream and its interpretation. Can you imagine how fascinated Nebuchadnezzar would have been by this? Wouldn't you have been? Now, in verse 37 is the constantly reminding that at this very appointment, Nebuchadnezzar was only king because God had given him that opportunity. That was the only reason. Daniel is beginning to educate the king now. He is going to be learning, but from the hand of God's appointed servant. And later we will see the glorious ending of this education. So wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field, the fowls of heaven, hath he given into their hand, and hath made thee a ruler over them. Thou art this head of gold. It's a repeat of Genesis chapter 1 and 28 if you want to tie it to Genesis. Beasts and birds are nations and people. Nebuchadnezzar was a model of human pride and power. His 43 years of reign were over half of the 70 in which Judah was captive. In the next class, we'll show that's not quite enough for Nebuchadnezzar, but we'll have to just wait a few minutes for that. Daniel tells him, your kingdom's going to end. Imagine that. Your kingdom, as strong as it is going to come to an end. There'll be an inferior kingdom and another one, but yours is going to end. And lining up later in Daniel chapter 7, we have the ram and the he-goat. We have chapter 8, beyond the scopes of our study for this weekend, but specifically naming the Medes and the Persians and the Greeks as the next two inferior kingdoms. And then we have a fourth kingdom as strong as iron. And this kingdom does give a little room for debate because the empire is not named by Daniel. However, the next succeeding world empire, also picked up by John, was allowed to pick up where Daniel left off and uses iron repeatedly as a description of the beast we can historically match to Rome. I would argue, but not bet body parts. If you wanted to think it's Turkey or Russia, I would disagree with you. I think it's clearly Rome, but Bible does not give us that specific. The other ones he does, our God does. So then we look at the feet, part iron, part clay. And here is a kingdom standing without unity, but a semblance of unity. Is that not what Europe is today? Remnants of a two-footed Roman influence still in existence, both political and religious. And in the days of those kings, we have a replacement kingdom coming. These kings, the last days, the days in which we stand. No more shaping and forming, but a divine kingdom will be established by the hand of our God. That is our hope. So the king makes Daniel a great man, and he gave him great gifts and made him ruler over the prince of Babylon, chief of the governor over all the wise men of Babylon. And Daniel requested of the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, his three friends, over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel sat in the gate of the king. Nebuchadnezzar kept his promise from verse 6. And even Daniel's friends now in verse 49 are elevated because of their association with Daniel. And we saw in the middle of the story that they got together. The circle never broke. Like as we can all be gathered and elevated together in a day when we stand in our small circle, holding each other fast to the things of our God, if we can just band together against the world around us. Let's conclude this first class with the last couple verses of Daniel 1. The king communed with them, and among them was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king. So though the four of them were previously acknowledged before Nebuchadnezzar, as we just called out in the last slide, they still had to stand before him in judgment. A beautiful type. We all will stand before the king in judgment, even if we've done well or whether we have not. We all will stand before the king. The thought assuredly the world called them by their new name, but God sees they have lived to their true names. Putting those names together, we have these four names stand as one, and here's what it says when put together. Yah is judge and has been gracious. He has helped us to be like him. How does that compare to the closest circle of friends you can have in any age? In all the matters of wisdom and understanding, the king inquired of them. He found them 10 times better than the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. 10 times just means many times. There's no actual math. It's just compounding. Better is actually the word hands. He has them 10 hands better. Now that's interesting. Who are the 10 hands? Daniel has 2, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. We have 8. And who are the other 2? Why not the hand of God? 10 hands better than anything else the world had to offer, because this circle had united to stand before each other in the hands of their God. The type, if the ecclesial world is noted as standard, it would be, if this ecclesial world noted it as above standard, it would be blessed by the king and even more elevated in the kingdom. Now, there's only 3 stories where the magicians appear throughout the Bible in the Hebrew word. Joseph before Pharaoh, Moses before Pharaoh, and here, pretty good company. Daniel continued even to the first year of King Cyrus. He didn't die that year, but rather the margin correctly reminds us that he continued to see the return of his people from captivity. More importantly, Daniel was seen as a standout by multiple kings in different kingdoms. Whether it's 17 or 90, he was the same representative of glorious Yahweh. Let that be found in all of us as we dare to be like Daniel, not only this weekend, but until our Lord shall return.
Thank you so very much, Brother Dennis. We really appreciate the introduction to your classes for the weekend. We'll have, it is now 2:04. The next class is scheduled to start at 2:15. So we'll take a few minutes break here, and then we'll get back and get into Brother Dennis's second class. Thanks everyone for your attention. I'll see you in a few minutes.